Plotter versus Pantser, a tale as old as time. One that you've likely heard discussed a dozen different ways. And to be honest, it is worth talking about, right? Looking at your own writing style is the very first step to understanding and evolving the way that you write. And that introspection is a critical part of the growth. The second that you start looking at how you write, asking questions about if this is the right way for you to tell or plan your story, that is the instant that you level up your writing. Today, we're gonna ditch that old planner versus pantser discussion for a more detailed pair of terms. Are you an architect or a gardener? Welcome to the Writing Theory Podcast, a podcast for every level of writer. Everything that we discuss here on this podcast is about pushing you to the next level of storytelling. From prose to structure to the business of writing, you can join me every Wednesday for a new episode, a new topic, and a new takeaway that you can apply to your own writing right away. I'm Carson Long. Let's get started. I really like the way that George R.R. Martin dissects writing. And for those who don't know, Martin has done way more than just A Song of Ice and Fire, the Game of Thrones books. And of course, that's what we know him for, but I have a lot of respect for his journey in writing long before those books. He was writing and selling short stories in the early 70s when he was just 20 years old. And even before the science fiction boom that Star Wars would bring, he was selling stories to magazines, and he was nominated for both a Hugo Award and a Nebula Award for those short stories. That doesn't necessarily translate to financial success. In 1972, there was a huge chess craze after Bobby Fischer won the World Chess Championship, and Martin got a job coordinating chess tournaments, and that's the job that supported him as he developed as an author for the next 3 years. He was the vice president for the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, and in the mid-'80s, he began writing for television, including The Twilight Zone, where he wrote a couple different episodes. But one worth mentioning is called The Once and Future King, where an Elvis Presley impersonator goes back in time, encounters Elvis, and then kills him and becomes the original Elvis himself. Oh, so good. And then in the early 90s, Martin returned to writing novels, and that's when he created A Game of Thrones. I think that George R.R. Martin brings a very informed and usually entertaining viewpoint to talking about storytelling. He's been doing it for so long. He's been so involved in the industry. And he's been successful in both creating stories and also supporting other creators. And I think that sets him apart from some of the other long-time great writers. So let's quickly go over plotters and pantsers before we look at George R.R. Martin's response to these terms, the architect and the gardener, and how these terms differ. You've probably been posed this question before. Are you a plotter or a pantser? And look, I get it. It's at some point you just need something to start the discussion. But I have to tell you, I kind of hate just even the terms and the ideas here. First off, how did we settle on pantser? How did we settle on this term pantser? And yeah, there's probably another term out there, but I've always been told it's plotters and pantsers. And of course, it's not one or the other. It's not a black and white thing. It's a gradient. You're somewhere between the two, but you more than likely lean closer to one side or the other side. And so that's kind of how we talk about this thing. So, of course, let's just go through, let's nail some things down. Let's talk about plotters, right? The people who plan or outline their story, typically to a pretty meticulous degree, before they start writing. And I'm interested to know in the viewers, the listeners for the podcast, what are you? Do you identify yourself more as a pantser or more as a plotter? And I think it's worth asking that question because you can kind of get some more specific feedback involving how you like to write stories by being able to tell, are you a plotter? Are you a pantser, right? Leave a comment. I would love to know. I would love to sort of gauge the idea. So plotters are typically the people who sit down with their idea, their characters, their setting, their plot, maybe even their theme already at the beginning of the writing process, and they create the plans, right? Here's the plot framework I'm going to use. Let me organize everything into a series of events that make sense. I know that I have this character. In fact, maybe you've gone through and you've done something like a character sheet so that you can better understand your character. That would definitely be a plotter kind of thing to do. Maybe you go through and you outline the character arc. I'm going to have a character who is shown to be some sort of coward at the beginning of the story, and by the end of the story, they have to be brave. A very basic character arc, and of course, it can get more detailed than that. And settings, world building. Plotters love world building, especially in, I'm a big science fiction and fantasy writer. That's one of the big appeals of this whole genre is sitting down and creating a world with cultures and locations, maybe religions, maybe magic. If you sit down and you put in all that effort to plan your world, that's the actions of a planner, of a plotter, right? You get a pretty clear roadmap of how you need to continue through the rest of your story. I would say that, plot frameworks are kind of the sign, kind of how I imagine most plotters have some plot framework that they want to work in. Of course, Save the Cat, maybe the most detailed plot framework that I know of, a clear fan favorite, where you get to go through and say, I have a story that's going to be 80,000 words. And Save the Cat's going to tell you, of your total word count, 10% of your story needs to include sort of the initial vision of the world. And then at 12% of your total word count, that's when your inciting incident needs to happen, or whatever those actual numbers are. I'm just pulling them off the top of my head. If you don't know about Save the Cat and you feel like other plot frameworks aren't giving you enough guidance, you should check it out. People who tend to not be plotters, not be people who are going through and outlining as, a crazy amount of detail about their stories, the response to this, sort of what other people see as the downside of the planners, is that you don't get to, be as creative, maybe. Maybe that's one of the downsides. I love discovering my characters. I love writing my characters and being surprised at what they do, and you can't do that as a plotter, which isn't necessarily true. But there's pretty major benefits to plotting out your story, to planning your story before you write it. Number one is going to be sort of staying on track for your story, not getting lost. In my opinion, the number one cause of something like writer's block is not having planned enough. And if you disagree, I would love to hear what you think the number one cause of writer's block might be. I think the times that I've most encountered writer's block have been times where I've just been writing. Maybe I did plan things out and I got off track and I don't know how to get to the next thing that needs to happen effectively. Is there another reason that you think people run into writer's block? Let me know in the comments below. Plotters tend to avoid some of those pitfalls by having this detailed plan. It helps you with your pacing. It helps you know where you need to go next. And also, and maybe this is a benefit, maybe it's not, they tend to have fewer wasted scenes is maybe the best way to phrase it. I think one of the fun parts, maybe it's an upside, like I said, maybe it's a downside, of being a pantser is writing the scene that feels right next as opposed to saying, in my plot framework, this is what needs to happen next. I'm going to create a scene where I have these two characters just going through life together and bonding. That's something that you would typically do as a pantser, but maybe you wouldn't go through that same scene if you know, oh, the next step of my plot framework is this next element of rising action. You know what I mean? Maybe that, like I said, maybe it's an upside, maybe it's a downside. But that's sort of the idea of plotters. I'm not going to waste too much time on these terms. But let's talk about pantsers, right? Pantsers are the spontaneous writers. Typically what you will hear from writing books or, authors who talk about how important it is to be a pantser, to be someone who just discovers the story, is they're going to say things like, I like discovering my characters. I like seeing them come into reality like a Polaroid picture. That's what Anne Lamott says. They're going to say things like, I like being surprised by my characters. Pantsers write by the seat of their pants without extensive planning. Doesn't mean that there isn't any planning, but without extensive planning, maybe without a detailed plot framework. Maybe they do have a plot framework, but they don't do any sort of planning about their characters. But to be honest, I gotta tell you, I hate this nomenclature. Pantsers? What are we doing here? What are we doing? I just if I'm talking to someone who's not in the writing space and this comes up, I almost feel kind of ashamed to be yeah, there's plotters and then there's pantsers. We write by the seat of their pants. So maybe these new terms we're about to talk about are a little bit better in those kind of situations. But anyways, back to pantsers. Pantsers typically rely on intuition to sort of know where the story's supposed to go next. And a lot of that intuition should be based on their knowledge of storytelling, but then also what should happen naturally next in the story, what they feel like should happen naturally in that story. And the idea is that writing in this method leads to more sort of unexpected yet organic plot developments, dynamic storytelling, character moments. That's the whole idea. If you are a pantser, I would imagine that's the big appeal. It's that I'm going to let my characters decide what to do next. So you see this come up a lot, especially with some of the great writing books. Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott, On Writing by Stephen King. In both of these books, they say, I like to discover this. Writing to a plot framework is like being in jail or something. They phrase it very strongly. I hate using plot frameworks. But I think that there is an element of this that is very much not being discussed in the way that it needs to be discussed. Here's the issue. A lot of great authors tell you that they are pantsers, but I think that they don't spend enough time talking about how pantsers need a strong foundation of storytelling knowledge in order to have their discovered story be successful. And you're probably saying that's what editing is for. You can pants your way through the proto draft of a story, and then at the end of it, you can be like, I'm going to edit it so it follows the general shape of modern storytelling. Here we have our inciting incident. Here's Act 2, where we have continuous rises and stakes. And then we have a big climax at the end. And yet, with a lot of the writing books that I read, I don't see a lot of discussion about that. So I'm here to tell you, and maybe there's a better video that I can make about this, because I'm kind of realizing it's, can I say an epidemic? Is that too serious? Can I treat this more seriously? Welcome to Plotgate. Do we have enough gates in this world? Do you know what I'm talking about? Watergate. There was Deflategate in the NFL. There was all kinds of Gamergate at some point. You know what? I think we're getting sidetracked. The great authors like Stephen King, like Anne Lamott, have that foundational knowledge of storytelling. What needs to happen 10% into your novel? How do you set up a character to have a successful payoff at the end of your story when you're in the second act? How do you build on top of what you've already written in a way that's going to lead to that natural conclusion. That foundational knowledge where these great authors are saying to be a pantser, like, I would never write to a plot outline. They have that, but they don't spend enough time telling, especially newer writers, that you have to have that knowledge. On Writing is probably the most popular writing book out there. And I say that because even people who are just getting interested in writing know Stephen King, know that he's a writer, and they see On Writing and they say, that's the book. That's what I'm going to read. And it's a decent book. It's half a memoir, half a writing book, whatever. But it is like a lot of people's first exposure to sort of more meta discussion about writing. But you need to be able to understand how to create pacing correctly, how to create moments of tension that have build-up and have resolution, maybe moments of foreshadowing that are going to pay off later, character development, conflict. But without these things, as an author, without them sitting down and playing it out, I don't think a lot of pantsers, especially if they're newer to writing, are going to be successful. And when I say successful, I don't mean commercially successful. I mean successful in just finishing their story. And I think this is the biggest issue with the idea of being a pantser, is that we're not talking about the skills that you need before you start writing as a pantser. And I almost think there's an evolution that you might go through where you should start as a plotter. And only as you get more experience with writing, maybe you consider incorporating more of these pantsing elements to how you like to write. Maybe you love the outline, you love plotting, and you just stick with being a plotter. People talk about pantsing like you sit down and you write, and it all just works out. And I think that leads to a lot of people being either confused, disappointed, or running into writer's block, which, like I said, I think this is the number one cause of writer's block. I said it, I stand by it. Now, like I said, it's all a gradient. It's not a black and white thing. So, of course, there's a middle ground. You might incorporate, the headlight method. We talked about this back in, I think, episode 1. The idea that you're going to plan out where your story is going to go, what sort of points your story needs to hit, and then you discover it along the way, right? Very popular method of writing. But the most important thing I want to bring up to you is the fact that you need to experiment with this. Simply talking about pantsers and plotters and whatever the middle ground is. I've seen the word plantsers around here, and I will not be saying that. I will die on this hill. We do not need to incorporate plantsers into the dynamic here. But it is important that you say, okay, I think I'm a pantser, but why don't I try writing a short story and very much plot it out? Or the other way, if you think that you really rely on that outline, maybe you have that foundational knowledge that if you go to being a pantser and give that a shot, maybe you discover that you like writing that way and it gets you all these benefits, or that you just confirm you like the plot outline. That sort of experiment, that is like one of the more important things you can do as a writer. And a great way to do that is to join our Discord, where we do writing challenges every couple months. And I give you an excuse to start and finish something and experiment with it. How about that? Wow. So with that conversation done, right? Plotters, we get it. Pantsers, we get it. Let's go to George R.R. Martin's alternative terms, right? A different perspective. What about architects, which is the equivalent to our plotters, versus gardeners? And this is a little bit more nuanced of a discussion. So let's look at it this way. So architects plan their stories meticulously, similarly to designing a building with detailed blueprints. They know the structure, they know the plot points, they know the character development before writing. And this approach is just like how we talked with planning. It's trying to create a well-structured narrative before you put the words down. And our last episode with Michael Crichton, fantastic example. Michael Crichton spends weeks with index cards with scenes and plot points and even dialogue and twists and puts them down in order and reshuffles things and moves them around until that plot looks like it covers all the elements that he wants to talk about. And then he puts them all in a stack, and when he sits down to write, he just picks that next index card off of the stack. And that's his whole writing method. That is very much the architect kind of idea. Now you're probably saying, hey, this sounds a lot like the planning thing we just talked about. And you're right, the architect idea doesn't differ too much from planning. But the gardener approach differs very much from the idea of pantsing your way through a novel. And that's what I want to focus on. A lot of writers, and you may not fall in this category, maybe you do, a lot of writers I think want to be the pantser, want to be the gardener, want to be the kind of writer that sits down and just creates magic. Wouldn't that be nice? If it was that easy, we'd all do it. I'll tell you that right now. But the different sort of perspective that Martin's going to bring to this idea of the gardener, is not that you just sit down and write, but instead you sort of organically cultivate your story. And this takes into account the idea of requiring some extra work besides what Stephen King kind of spouts, just sitting down and writing. Or Anne Lamott just watching a Polaroid become developed. And hey, there's your awesome character that you want to tell your story with. Instead, this acknowledges the extra stuff you need to do. So the idea is that gardeners allow their stories to grow organically, right? We're planting the seed of an idea and then watching it grow, but we're also nurturing it. And let's figure out what that means. Step one, there's work we do before putting that seed, that little idea of a story, into the ground. You're tilling your soil, right? That's the foundational work of preparing yourself to be able to write at the level you need to be writing. In my opinion, this is the work you might do in regards to things like understanding why plot frameworks work, internalizing the information of how plots pay off and how they need to be built, and creating moments of conflict and twists and things like that. Tilling the soil is you doing that preparation, understanding that story. You're not going to get very far unless you do some work to the ground, right? Unless you do that foundational knowledge. But something you might also need to do is to fertilize that soil before the seed goes down. And what does that mean? In this case, that's going to be things like preparing additional ideas that are going to come into your story. Maybe not writing down a full plot framework, but saying, I have this idea for this world, right? I have these ideas for these characters. Doing some preparation that's going to help ensure the growth and success of your story. Providing yourself with the nutrients, the ideas, right? That's the fertilizer that's going to help your story grow how it needs to grow. But then, after you put that seed in the ground, you need to keep coming back to it and nurturing it. Maybe that is watering it. Basically, reading what you've written and figuring out, is this working? Where do I need to steer this story next? I'm just going to help it grow. Maybe you need to prune it. You need to trim things back. Oh, I started going down this tangent, but my foundational knowledge of storytelling is telling me that this is not the right move. I'm going to maybe cut that back. Maybe you need to go through and you need to cut out the blight. How good of a word is blight? Am I right? You need to be able to recognize, I've made a decision in my storytelling here that is not going to be the right move. This idea of cultivating this thing as it grows, I think, is a more realistic interpretation of writing without a plot outline. It requires you to still do that extra work, to have the knowledge prepared to ensure a successful storytelling experience. And it's not just, I'm going to sit down and write by the seat of my pants, which makes it seem like the easiest freaking thing in the world. But instead, I'm going to, spend my time doing work in a different way so that I can then write in this method. You may not know the exact direction of the story, and you can still be spontaneous, and you can still discover your characters and be surprised at the things that they do. But you're also looking at your story as a story, knowing the direction it needs to go because you have that foundational knowledge, knowing when maybe you're messing up and how to correct it. That's a very important part of writing by the seat of your pants that was not talked about as a pantser. And look, writing this way can lead to natural storytelling. So can plotting it out. Writing this way can lead to rich, character-driven narratives. So can plotting it out. Writing this way can lead to moments that are incredibly fun. So can plotting. This is all your own preference, but I want to make sure that we're talking about everything that goes into this writing experience instead of just saying, yeah, just sit down and write. Because that's not going to lead to the majority of writers who are trying this out being able to successfully finish that story. And maybe that's been you in the past. Maybe no one's ever told you about this. And just discovering this may unlock something in your brain. And the best way you can solve this is by doing that experimentation, by trying to write something in a different way. I'll tell you, you've likely heard my writing process before. I plan out my plot pretty meticulously until the inciting incident. And I typically know how the story is going to end. And I let my sort of characters discover the path between those two things. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes I plot more, sometimes I plot less. Of course, we all land between these two extremes. No one's ever going to be purely one or the other. You can combine planning your story out with discovering things. That's easy. That's just normal writing, I think. But understanding sort of where you lie in this spectrum of understanding how you like to write, what your strengths are, it kind of helps you understand what kind of writing content you want to consume that will help you do that process better. For example, if you love writing to a plot, or developing a plot, or doing a crazy amount of world building before you write, then maybe Stephen King's not the person you want to be taking writing advice from, as someone who notoriously doesn't do that. Maybe Brandon Sanderson is the gold standard for understanding how you like to write and getting advice that strengthens the way that you write. That's the value of trying to dissect the way that you write. It helps you understand yourself better and seek out additional materials that will also strengthen your writing. Martin's two new terms aren't groundbreaking, but they bring a little bit more nuance to the idea of just pantsing your way through a story. And because we've sort of decided pantsing is just like sit down and write, it really lacks additional context. So here's what I want you to do. If you're interested in evolving your writing process, write a short story using a different method of development than you normally do. Just see how it goes. Maybe you discover you like plotting. Maybe you discover you thrive in the discovery. But in the same way that an athlete goes out and trains, you have to write to really understand these things, to really refine them. That's just what writing is. I got a comment on one of my writing book breakdown videos the other week that was talking about maybe we're getting too technical in trying to understand writing. And maybe in trying to understand it to too detailed of a degree, it's confusing people. When in reality, how can you break down something like art into a series of steps or mathematical formulas or plot frameworks when writing is something that has soul and heart? And I gotta tell you, personally, I very much disagree with that. And I'd like to hear maybe your thoughts on that. In my opinion, telling someone that a story is good because it feels good does not help that person then write better stories. And in the same way that artists practice new techniques of writing or incorporate the rule of thirds into their composition or purposely choose to use the golden ratio in an element of their painting, There are things that you can learn and study and see how it can benefit what you want to write. And that's why this podcast and this whole YouTube channel exists. I want you to discover writing. It's not a magical thing. It's not something that exists out there in the ether. It's not something that you can't understand. It very much is. It's just putting words down in a way that you like. And the way that you like may be different than the way another person likes it. I've been talking about this in my discussion on prose. I might find prose to be successful when it's very direct and actionable and moves things along quickly, while someone else might read prose that's very detailed and purple and uses fancy words and be like, wow, that's beautiful. I want to write like that. And that's not how I feel. There are different ways to approach this. And because there are different ways to approach this, we can analyze each one of these approaches and understand it better. I want you to harness your strengths and improve your weaknesses. And that's what we're going to do together. I hope you like this podcast episode, this discussion on kind of a topic that already exists out in the world. Let me know, are there any topics that you would like sort of explored? Anything that you struggle with? Anything that you are interested in and you're having trouble finding that content? If you have more thoughts, if you want to be part of a larger discussion, again, come join us in the Discord. We have great discussions about each episode of the podcast, what people liked, didn't like, what they agreed with, didn't agree with, and it's all fun and it's all helpful. The podcast is a lot of fun for me to do. I hope you have a good time listening to it. This is the kind of content for when you're not at your computer, but maybe you still want to be passionate about writing. That's why I like writing podcasts. Maybe you're the same way. Anyways, that's all I have for you for today. I'll see you next Wednesday.